The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln, by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 24b. General Joseph Hooker, the fourth commander of the heroic but unfortunate Army of the Potomac, was appointed to that position by President Lincoln in January, 1863. The two men had met briefly early in the war, when Hooker, then living in California, hastened to Washington to offer his services to the Government. But for some reason General Scott disliked him, and his offer was not accepted. After some months, Hooker, giving up the idea of getting a command, decided to return to California. But before leaving he called to pay his respects to the President. He was introduced as Captain Hooker. The President, being pressed for time, was about to dismiss him with a few civil phrases, when, to his surprise, Hooker began the following speech: "Mr. President, my friend makes a mistake. I am not Captain Hooker, but was once Lieutenant Colonel Hooker, of the regular army. I was lately a farmer in California. Since the rebellion broke out I have been trying to get into the service, but I find I am not wanted. I am about to return home, but before going I was anxious to pay my respects to you, and to express my wishes for your personal welfare and success in quelling this rebellion. And I want to say one word more. I was at Bull Run the other day, Mr. President, and it is no vanity in me to say am a damned sight better general than you had on that field." This was said not in the tone of a braggart, but of a man who knew what he was talking about. And as the President afterwards said, he appeared at that moment as if perfectly able to make good his words. Lincoln seized his hand, making him sit down, and began an extended chat. The result was that Hooker did not return to California, but in a few weeks Captain Hooker was Brigadier General Hooker. He served with distinction under McClellan in the Peninsular Campaign and at Antietam, and commanded the right wing of the army at Fredericksburg. He had come to be known as Fighting Joe Hooker, and was generally regarded as one of the most vigorous and efficient generals of the Union army. Such was the man who, in one of the darkest hours of the Union cause, was selected to lead once more the Army of the Potomac against the enemy. This army, since its defeat at Fredericksburg, had remained disorganized and ineffective. Its new commander, unlike his predecessor Burnside, was full of confidence. The President, made cautious by experience, deemed it his duty to accompany the appointment by some timely words of warning, and accordingly he addressed to General Hooker the following frank, manly, and judicious letter: Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., January 26, 1863. Major General Hooker. General: I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course, I have done this upon what appear to me to be sufficient reasons, and yet I think it best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier, which of course I like. I also believe that you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable, if not indispensable, quality. You are ambitious, which, within reasonable bounds, does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the army you have taken counsel with your ambition, and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the army and the Government needed a dictator. Of course it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain success can be dictators. What I now ask from you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. The Government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has done, and will do for all commanders. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse into the army, of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him, will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to pull it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it. And now, beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance go forward and give us victories. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln. In all Lincoln's writings, there are few things finer than this letter. In its candor and friendliness, its simplicity and deep wisdom, and its clearness of expression, it is almost perfect; and the President's deep solicitude for the safety of the army and anxiety for its success give a pathetic touch to the closing sentences. This solicitude found partial relief in a personal inspection of the Army of the Potomac, which was made in April, just before the battle of Chancellorsville, and occupied 5 or 6 days. The President was accompanied by Attorney General Bates, Mrs. Lincoln, his son Tad, and Mr. Noah P. Brooks. The first night out was spent on the little steamer which conveyed the party to their destination. After all had retired to rest except the anxious President and 1 or 2 others, Lincoln gave utterance to his deep-seated apprehensions in the whispered query to his friend, "How many of our monitors will you wager are at the bottom of Charleston harbor?" "I essayed," writes Mr. Brooks, "to give a cheerful view of the Charleston situation, but he would not be encouraged." He then went on to say that he did not believe that an attack by water on Charleston could ever possibly succeed. He talked a long time about his "notions," as he called them, and at General Halleck's headquarters next day the first inquiries were for rebel papers, which were usually brought in from the picket lines. These he examined with great anxiety, hoping that he might find an item of news from Charleston. One day, having looked all over a Richmond paper several times without finding a paragraph which he had been told was in it, he was mightily pleased to have it pointed out to him, and said, "It is plain that the newspapers are made for newspaper men. Being only a layman, it was impossible for me to find that." The outdoor life, the constant riding, and the respite from the monstrous burdens at the Capitol appeared to afford mental and physical benefit to the worn President. But in answer to a remark expressing this conviction, he replied sadly, "I don't know about the rest, as you call it. I suppose it is good for the body, but the tired part of me is inside and out of reach." He rode a great deal, says Mr. Brooks, while with the army, always preferring the saddle to the elegant ambulance which had been provided for him. He sat his horse well, but he rode hard, and during his stay I think he regularly used up at least 1 horse each day. Little Tad invariably followed in his father's train, and mounted on a smaller horse, accompanied by an orderly, the youngster was a conspicuous figure, as his gray cloak flew in the wind, while we hung on the flanks of Hooker and his generals. General Hooker was now planning his great movement against Richmond, and talked freely of the matter with the President. In the course of a conversation, Lincoln casually remarked, "If you get to Richmond, General." But Hooker interrupted him with, "Excuse me, Mr. President, but there is no 'if' in the case. I am going straight to Richmond, if I live." Later in the day Lincoln, privately referring to this self-confidence of the General, said to Mr. Brooks, rather mournfully, "It is about the worst thing I have seen since I have been down here." In further illustration of Hooker's confidence in himself, Mr. Brooks says, "One night, Hooker and I being alone in his hut, the General standing with his back to the fireplace, alert, handsome, full of courage and confidence, said laughingly, 'The President says you know about that letter he wrote to me on taking command.' I acknowledged that the President had read it to me. The General seemed to think that the advice was well meant, but unnecessary. Then he added, with that charming assurance which became him so well, 'After I have been to Richmond, I am going to have that letter printed.' But all that came of Hooker's confidence, after 3 months of elaborate preparation, was a grand forward movement into Virginia and another bloody and humiliating defeat for the heroic but unfortunate army under his command. The 1st of May, 1863, the Army of the Potomac under Hooker met the Army of Northern Virginia under Lee and Jackson, near Chancellorsville, Virginia. It was here that Jackson executed his brilliant and successful flank movement around the Union right, ensuring a victory for his side, but losing his own life. After a contest of several days, involving the fruitless sacrifice of thousands of gallant soldiers, Hooker's army fell back and recrossed the Rappahannock. Footnote: the cause of General Hooker's seeming stupefaction at the critical point of the Chancellorsville battle has been much discussed but never satisfactorily explained. It has been thought that he was disabled by the shock of a cannon ball striking a post or pillar of the house where he had his headquarters. An interesting entry in Welles's diary, made soon after the battle, reflects somewhat the feeling at the time. Sumner expresses an absolute want of confidence in Hooker, says he knows him to be a blasphemous wretch, that after crossing the Rappahannock and reaching Centreville, Hooker exultingly exclaimed, "The enemy are in my power, and God Almighty cannot deprive me of them." I have heard before of this, but not so direct and positive. The sudden paralysis that followed, when the army in the midst of a successful career was suddenly checked and commenced its retreat, has never been explained. Whiskey is said by Sumner to have done the work. The President said that if Hooker had been killed by the shot which knocked over the pillar that stunned him, we should have been successful. The news of this fresh disaster was an almost stunning shock to President Lincoln. During the progress of the battle he was under a cruel strain of anxiety and suspense. Secretary Welles, who was with him a part of the time, says, "He had a feverish eagerness for facts, which was constantly up and down, for nothing reliable came from the front." Mr. Noah Brooks relates that in company with an old friend of Lincoln's he was waiting in one of the family rooms of the White House. A door opened, and Lincoln appeared, holding an open telegram in his hand. The sight of his face and figure was frightful. He seemed stricken with death. Almost tottering to a chair, he sat down, and then I mechanically noticed that his face was of the same color as the wall behind him, not pale, not even sallow, but gray, like ashes. Extending the dispatch to me, he said with a hollow, far-off voice, "Read it. News from the army." The telegram was from General Butterfield, I think, then Chief of Staff to Hooker. It was very brief, simply saying that the Army of the Potomac had safely recrossed the Rappahannock, and was now at its old position on the north bank of that stream. The President's friend, Dr. Henry, an old man and somewhat impressionable, burst into tears, not so much probably at the news as on account of its effect upon Lincoln. The President regarded the old man for an instant with dry eyes, and said, "What will the country say? Oh, what will the country say?" He seemed hungry for consolation and cheer, and sat a little while talking about the failure. Yet it did not seem that he was disappointed so much for himself, but that he thought the country would be. Lincoln's anxiety regarding the effect at the North of these repeated reverses was not without sufficient cause. Aside from those who were positively opposed to the war, the loyal people were wearying of the useless slaughter, the unavailing struggles of the gallant soldiers. The growing distrust of the capacity of their military leaders was also keenly felt. The feeling of that time is so well expressed in a stirring poem entitled "Wanted, a Man," written by Mr. E.C. Stedman, that it is given place here. It has an additional personal interest connected with President Lincoln in the fact that he was so impressed with the piece that he read it aloud to his assembled Cabinet. Back from the trebly crimsoned field terrible words are thunder-tossed, full of the wrath that will not yield, full of revenge for battles lost. Hark to their echo as it crossed the Capitol, making faces wan. End this murderous holocaust. Abraham Lincoln, give us a man. Give us a man of God's own mold, born to marshal his fellow men, one whose fame is not bought and sold at the stroke of a politician's pen. Give us the man of 1010, fit to do as well as to plan. Give us a rallying cry, and then, Abraham Lincoln, give us a man. No leader to shirk the boasting foe, and to march and countermarch our brave till they fall like ghosts in the marshes low, and swamp grass covers each nameless grave. Nor another, whose fatal banners wave, I in disaster's shameful van. Nor another to bluster and lie and rave. Abraham Lincoln, give us a man. Hearts are mourning in the North, while the sister rivers seek the main. Red with our life blood flowing forth, who shall gather it up again? Though we march to the battle plain firmly as when the strife began, Shall all our offerings be in vain? Abraham Lincoln, give us a man. Is there never one in all the land, one on whose might the cause may lean? Are all the common ones so grand, and all the titled ones so mean? What if your failure may have been in trying to make good bread from bran, from worthless metal a weapon keen? Abraham Lincoln, find us a man. Oh, we will follow him to the death, where the foeman's fiercest columns are. Oh, we will use our latest breath, cheering for every sacred star. His to marshal us high and far, ours to battle, as patriots can when a hero leads the holy war. Abraham Lincoln, give us a man.